Much of what the Ethereum camp said about Bitcoin and its maximalists wasn't just criticism, it was almost maliciously strategic marketing. For example, the term blockchain 2.0 completely cornered the Bitcoin community. At the time, it was overwhelmingly powerful. I remember thinking, this is wickedly smart marketing. Claims like Bitcoin is outdated and slow, all those FUD narratives came from their side. Ethereum's ruthlessly strategic marketing really angered us. And on top of that, they were wrong in many cases, flat out wrong. But here's something worth noting. You know, I don't just talk about Bitcoin, I often bring up geopolitics too. That's because Bitcoin opened my eyes to the bigger picture. Here's what economic thinkers often miss. They don't realize economics and finance are essentially layer 2 riding for free on top of military geopolitics, like a layer 2 system. They have no understanding of that foundational truth, but that doesn't mean layer 2 is just a passive, dependent variable with no impact on layer 1. That's simply not the case. After all, even military geopolitics depends on economic success to remain viable. So in that sense, finance might actually be the real layer 1, more foundational than geopolitics. But in terms of how the world currently works, it's like the internet and financial systems are running atop aircraft carriers. Let me point out what Bitcoin maximalists really need to pay attention to right now. Last year, Ethereum completed the merge and switched to proof of stake. That shift introduced a validator-based system. But these validators aren't checking transactions manually. They delegate that job to bots or automated programs. This process involves something called MEV. While it's convenient, it also introduces new problems. The US Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control OFAC issued a blacklist, and validators began complying, avoiding those on-chain transactions as instructed. At one point, as much as 80% of validators were following those restrictions. Now the number fluctuates between 60% and 70%. Hearing that, you might wonder, wait, if a blockchain complies when the US says no, is it really censorship resistant? You would think, that's nothing, it's garbage, just another worthless shitcoin. Let's stretch our thinking just a bit further. In the long run, the Bitcoin maximalists may well be right. That Bitcoin, being the most neutral, will become the most important asset. But being the most important asset doesn't mean it'll be the fastest rising one, nor will it necessarily be the most widely used. If you don't catch this nuance, you end up believing just because you like it, and assuming it must be right simply because you believe in it. Everything else gets labeled as heresy or deviation from the truth, so I encourage you, stay flexible, keep your thinking supple. When I started exploring the humanistic side of Bitcoin, back in 2014 to 2015, watching foreign YouTube channels and reading articles, I felt real awe toward the Bitcoin maximalists, the core developers, the hardcore Bitcoiners. They were geniuses and total hardheads. As I wrote in my book, they were stubborn, even unreasonable at times. But their charisma completely overpowered their rigidity. To be a true Bitcoin maximalist, you have to be more than just stubborn. You have to be a genius. If you're not that level of genius, then you'd better be flexible. Here's what I think. For the US, financial networks aren't really seen as tools for power balancing. In fact, when it comes to financial networks, America has acted as if it were the world government. But when it comes to Bitcoin, the US hesitates to back Bitcoin too open because it feels like too big a risk. It's just too heavy a political lift. But if you look at reports from DARPA, you'll see they still hold on to one hope. They say most of Bitcoin's 10,000 plus nodes are actually zombies. Why zombies? Because they installed the software ages ago, never updated it, and now they just follow others. They're not making independent judgments. It may sound like a critique of Bitcoin, but it's really the US clinging to the hope of controlling it in a crisis. Mathematically speaking, a 51% attack might not even require 51%, 30% could be enough. Because most nodes don't verify independently, they just follow the lead. So if 30% moves in lockstep, another 20% may just follow by default. And boom, you've crossed the 50% threshold. Someone actually worked this out mathematically. Well, not a proof per se, but a solid logical construction. Now let's look at Ethereum's compliance. Ethereum would rather keep that term out of sight. Because while it boasts censorship resistance, it's already being censored by nation states. But if you look at Buterin and the Ethereum community's recent rhetoric, they've been downplaying resistance to state censorship for several years now. They've broken the idea of censorship resistance into subcategories, and now argue that resisting state censorship is just one dimension of it. I'll come back to that in more detail another time. But here's what really matters. This is all entirely possible. From a US perspective, Ethereum might actually be convenient, which is why Buterin himself, as a liberal, seems aligned with American liberal ideals. He's an idealist because he's a liberal at heart. That might explain why he's taken this path. He may also be trying to align himself with US liberal opinion leaders. Buterin knows exactly what proof of work really represents. Even though he understands the superior nature of an energy-based system, he abandoned proof of work and shifted to proof of stake. They're clearly trying to align with something. Here's how you need to think about this. From the US perspective, backing Ethereum might be more convenient. Why? What the US really wants, regardless of whether it's realistic or not, is capital that flows freely without controls. And that's what sets the US apart from most other nations. It's unusual for a global superpower to advocate for free capital flows. Most governments want tight control over capital by default, but the US supports free movement of capital while still wanting to retain control at critical moments. So it's not about constant control, it's about strategic control. They want the ability to intervene when it really matters, especially over critical systems or assets. So if Ethereum's compliance rate consistently stays above 50%, that signals to US authorities that this could be a viable tool. If a majority of Ethereum validators become tied to US-based exchanges, you get a system that promotes capital freedom outside the US, but still allows for US control in key moments. That potential for control is precisely what matters to US policy. That's why, in the long run, Bitcoin's neutrality and its complete detachment from this kind of politicization. But at DARPA, they view Bitcoin's zombie nodes as a possible point of leverage. They're looking at the absolute fringe scenario, to be honest. In fact, finance doesn't operate in such extremes most of the time. Still, when push comes to shove, you want a system that can defend or push back if necessary. Ethereum happens to have those attributes. That's something we all need to pay close attention to. Even Ethereum supporters should consider if it is wise to openly challenge a liberal democratic state like the US or not. Buterin once had a famous public Twitter debate with Dan Larimer, the co-founder of EOS. Larimer said, "Why are you always talking about doing illegal things?" Well, EOS runs with 21 designated delegators, and if the US government raided or shut them down, the whole network could. So Larimer's view was, why even think about doing illegal things? Just operate within what the government permits. To Ethereum folks, that made EOS look overly compliant, but for Bitcoin maxis watching this debate, it was actually pretty ironic. Because that's the exact same logic Bitcoiners use against Ethereum. Because Ethereum is now on proof of stake, though at the time it wasn't even on POS yet. Everything's tangled together, it's messy and ironic. It's also intertwined. Let's assume that you're actually the game changers, the ones who hold the capital. Whichever side you support, if you amplify what you believe is right, it gains strength. And if you call out what's wrong, it gets weaker. If you hold that kind of influence, then moral judgment becomes crucial. Ideological discernment really matters. But for most of us, like you and me, we just have to adapt. We are just micro-level actors. We need to watch this space carefully and stay flexible. Maybe, just maybe, Bitcoin got pushed back 2 years because of Putin. Before the war, big corporations were about to plant their flags in Bitcoin. But once Putin hinted at using Bitcoin, those corporations backed away fast. So there's a chance that Ethereum could actually have an opportunity. It's a system that's highly compliant, with built-in assumptions that the US can exert control at critical moments. That's my perspective. It's almost the opposite view of what most people assume. You usually assume that the stronger the censorship resistance, but the world operates on a spectrum. It's not a binary world of zeros and ones. It's a continuum with infinite shapes. To put it simply, and I say this with all due respect to Bitcoin maximalists, Bitcoin's resilience makes it pointless to censor Ethereum or other networks. Since Bitcoin holds the line, censorship loses its bite. However, for the US, some level of control might still be desirable at key moments. If it's not just 0 or 1, then maybe there's a viable answer in the middle, a spectrum worth considering. Bitcoin, like it or not, has a radical image. It's perceived as something embraced by Russia, El Salvador, even North Korea. That's the perception out there. But North Korea can't use Ethereum anymore. Because once OFAC publishes wallet addresses and says don't allow these on chain, about 70% of Ethereum blocks now comply and exclude them. Bitcoin doesn't do that, it doesn't comply. If you were a US regulator, would you approve a Bitcoin ETF first? Or Ethereum? Which ETF would you greenlight? That's the kind of thinking you need to wrestle with. Stay flexible. For this year, I ask you to stay flexible with me on these foundational issues. You can't fully understand Bitcoin by studying only Bitcoin. If that were true, Bitcoin would be extremely simple to grasp. But studying only Bitcoin won't help you see its future. See you next time. Thank you.